Okay, so can you tell me, who is J.J.Slauerhoff?
Jan Jacob Slauerhoff was a ship's doctor in the Dutch East Indies in the 1920s and 30s, and he was also one of the Netherlands' most important modern writers. He was a poet primarily. He only wrote 2 novels, but he published several volumes of very important poetry, none of which I've read. I don't read Dutch very well, but that's irrelevant in a way. And this book, Adrift in the Middle Kingdom, was brought to me by the translator, David Mackay. Now, David and I had worked together some years ago because he had been commissioned to translate a novel called, in English, War and Turpentine. And I had been commissioned by the Dutch Literary Foundation to mentor him because he needed someone to work with who knew about First World War history and also, as it happened, the First World War in Belgium. And I did know a good bit about that. So he and I worked together very well, and that was fine. We got on extremely well. And then when he heard I was starting a publishing house, he said, "You must publish Slauerhoff." And I went, who? I didn't know anything about Slauerhoff, but I have since learned that if you mention Slauerhoff's name to any Dutch person, they'll go, "Oh, Slauerhoff, yes, wow." So he's important. His first novel had been translated, The Forbidden Kingdom, and it was published in 2012 by Pushkin Press. But the second novel never had, and it's linked to The Forbidden Kingdom, but it's actually, I think it's a standalone novel in its own right. It is a very odd novel. It's a straightforward realist narrative. A man whose name we eventually learn is Cameron, who's supposed to be a Belfast ship's radio operator, in 1926, 27, late 20s-ish. His ship is docking at Shanghai, near Shanghai, and he decides he's got to get off the ship. He can't bear to be at sea any longer. He needs to find himself, find his true calling, as far away from the sea as possible. So he jumps ship, he has his pay with him, and he gets to Shanghai. He has an opium problem. Throughout the novel, opium is a thread of constant, it's either addiction or death from opium, or growing opium, or opium as a medicine. It's always, always there. So Cameron has a bit of an opium problem. He gets over it slightly when he stays in the house of a watchmender, which happens at the same time as the siege of Shanghai in 1926. But this is not real history, this is a constructed history. And then he travels inland beyond the Great Wall of China in a gun convoy. And then it gets a bit weird. It gets into fantasy because he has an existential death and rebirth, and he trains with a monk, and he goes to a kind of nirvana-like place. It's rather like Lost Horizon and Shangri-La. It's all very strange, but it makes perfect sense when you're reading it. It's a really, really enthralling description of China in the 20s, about peasant China, upper class China, the whole gamut of classes. It is remarkable, and so David was wanting desperately to do the translation. I applied for a grant from the Dutch Literary Foundation, and I got a 100% grant, so that's how we're doing the novel.
And who will it appeal to in English readers?
It'll definitely appeal to people who know about Slauerhoff, so anyone who has studied or is interested in Dutch literature will find this fascinating. This is the first English translation of a novel by one of the Netherlands' most important writers. That's significant enough. Anyone interested in China, history of China, writing about China, adventure stories about China, stories about China and social conditions. Anyone who wants to read an extraordinary 1920s novel.
Excellent. So you personally, why did you want to publish this book? What do you like about it?
I just found it enthralling, and I'd never read anything quite like it before. It was the descriptions of what life was like with a background of warlords trying to take over China and rule it as a unified empire. Because the Chinese emperor had fallen, the Kuomintang were in power, but so were some warlords in the north. So you have this background of constant warfare, constant threat, but people at the front just trying to live their lives, get their crops in, bring up their children. And meanwhile you've got this gun-running convoy making its way along the Yangtze River in a ship. It's just remarkable. It's like a travelogue and a novel at the same time. Did he do lots of research? Do you think it's factually, historically, relatively accurate? Or? Well, he certainly visited Shanghai. He wasn't there at the time the Shanghai siege was happening, and he had many friends and contacts who gave him information. He didn't travel to the interior, as far as we know, so that is largely invented or drawn from descriptions, contemporary descriptions. So half and half.
Who would you liken? Is there a novelist you would liken him to? People might like.
John Steinbeck comes to mind.
Right.
I can't think. Maybe Laurie Lee. Maybe, possibly. Similar period. They're a little later, but they're the two that jump to mind straight away. Yeah.
Excellent.